You know, back in the early 1500s, during the Age of Exploration, it was all about gold and glory. Mighty ships were crossing oceans looking for treasure. But some people were driven by a totally different kind of ambition, something deeper. So this is a story about that kind of ambition.
So how does that happen? How does someone's life goal switch from conquering lands to, well, conquering souls? That's the incredible story we're diving into today, the story of a man named Francis Xavier. His quest started out pretty standard, a desire for power and prestige, but it completely transformed into a spiritual mission that would literally take him to the other side of the world.
All right, so let's start at the beginning. Our story begins with Francisco de Xavier. He was born into a noble family in a castle that was actually named Xavier. And fun fact, Xavier means new house. For young Francis, that name represented a whole life of privilege and a huge legacy he was expected to carry on. But that life? Yeah, it was completely shattered, and it happened fast. When Francis was just a kid, a king's ambition basically destroyed his entire world. His homeland was invaded, his family's lands were taken away, their wealth just vanished. And this whole disaster ultimately led to his father's death, leaving the family disgraced and totally ruined.
And imagine this, with his dying words, Francis's father puts the entire weight of the family's future right on his shoulders. This wasn't just a simple request, this was a heavy, heavy burden to restore their lost honor. Talk about pressure. And that pressure, it would define the whole first half of his life.
So, Francis comes up with a plan. He heads to the University of Paris and he's got a clear goal. Use his brilliant mind to become a scholar priest, get all the prestige and money he needs, and restore his family's honor. But then, in Paris, he met a roommate who was about to change everything.
His new roommate was a man named Ignatius of Loyola. And you can see it right here. These two couldn't have been more different. They were total polar opposites. While Francis was chasing worldly success climbing the ladder, Ignatius had already had a noble background and had renounced it all for a life of poverty. To Francis, this guy was just a nuisance, maybe even a bad influence on ambitious young men.
But Ignatius was persistent. He saw that ambitious fire in Francis and he started to challenge it, not with big arguments or lectures, but with his single, piercing question that just started to echo in Francis's mind. This was the question. I mean, think about that. It completely pulled the rug out from under his whole life plan. All of a sudden, he's asking himself, is restoring my family's name and fortune really worth losing my very soul? That thought, it haunted him, day and night.
And slowly but surely that question broke him down. And then it rebuilt him. You see, Francis's ambition didn't just disappear. It was completely redirected. He decided to give up his quest for worldly honor and to join Ignatius on a radically different path. So, he and 6 companions met up in this small chapel just outside Paris to formally renounce their old lives. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, committing themselves completely to a life of service. And for Francis, this meant giving up a really prestigious church appointment he'd already secured back in his homeland. He walked away from it all.
When it was finally time for Francis to leave on his first mission, Ignatius didn't give him a map or any money. He gave him a simple command, a powerful charge to go out and ignite a spiritual passion all across the globe.
And that mission? It came up suddenly. The Pope had requested priests for the Portuguese colonies way out in the east. But just before they were set to leave, one of the chosen priests got too sick to travel. And so, Francis was asked to take his place.
And get this, he was given just 1 day's notice. A single day to say goodbye to his friends and get ready to leave Europe and everything he'd ever known forever. And he accepted, without a moment's hesitation. So after a really perilous journey by sea, he lands in Goa, India. And he did not waste a second. He immediately started walking the streets, ringing a little bell, and gathering children together to teach them their prayers and the commandments. He really believed that if you could reach the children, you could then reach their parents.
A quote from one of his own letters really gives you a sense of the relentless physical toll of his mission. The scale of his work was just immense. He wasn't just preaching, he was performing so many baptisms that some days he literally could no longer lift his arms.
For 10 years, this was his life, a decade. He journeyed all across India to Malacca and through the islands of modern-day Indonesia. He faced storms that nearly sank his ship, trekked through unforgiving jungles, and was just constantly moving from one village to the next, healing the sick and establishing new faith communities wherever he went.
After a full decade of this relentless work, Francis set his sights on his final frontier, his ultimate goal, the vast, closed-off empire of China.
There was just one massive problem. At the time, China strictly prohibited foreigners from entering its borders. I mean, if you were caught, you were looking at imprisonment or even worse. It was a wall he was determined to breach.
He'd actually arranged for safe passage as part of a diplomatic mission, but his plans were completely sabotaged. The local Portuguese governor, a guy named Don Alvaro, apparently held a personal grudge against him and used his power to block the entire mission, furiously vowing that Francis would never set foot in China.
But Francis wasn't deterred. He found a merchant who was willing to smuggle him onto the mainland. So he traveled to this desolate island just off the coast of China to wait for the boat. But the boat never came. And there, all alone, racked with a terrible fever, he died, his eyes fixed on the coastline that he never managed to reach.
So in the end, he failed to achieve his final goal, but his story, it poses this fascinating question. He gave up the world to save his soul, and in doing that, he created a legacy that far outlived him. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does it truly mean to set the world on fire?